Welcome back to Outdoors Type. In this video, I'm going to be exploring a once very busy but now abandoned section of railway line near Port Pirie. Crystal Brook was once not a junction station. The junction was moved here when the standard gauge line was built through to Adelaide from Port Pirie. The old broad gauge section from Meriton to Port Pirie was abandoned. How did it get this way, and what does it look like today? Let's find out. Let's start with an explanation of the importance of the old broad gauge line from Port Pirie to Adelaide to learn just how busy this abandoned stretch once was. From 1875, Port Pirie had a narrow gauge line from Gladstone that carried products to the port down the middle of its main street, and from 1888 the line carried silver, lead and zinc ore from Broken Hill and sulfuric acid. Gross. By 1900, Port Pirie's main station was a Victorian pavilion-style building in Ellen Street, and Port Pirie was becoming an important town, but it had no direct rail link with Adelaide. A broad gauge railway line, part of the South Australian Railways network, reached Port Pirie from Adelaide in 1937 and was added to the two narrow gauge tracks in Ellen Street. The line from Adelaide to Port Pirie started in 1915 as a branch from the Salisbury to Gawler line. It was then built to Long Plains and made it to Red Hill in 1925. It finally made it to Port Pirie in 1937, giving the broad gauge line a much more direct route to Adelaide. Port Pirie Junction Station opened in 1937 in Solomon Town to accommodate the break of gauge between the broad gauge from Adelaide and the newly completed standard gauge line from Port Augusta and Perth. By 1967, long-distance broad and standard gauge passenger trains had become much longer than the Port Pirie Junction platform, and it was replaced by Port Pirie Mary Ely Street Station. The 1940s until the 1980s were essentially the golden age of rail to Port Pirie. The predominant locos in service on the route were the 520 class. They got their nickname Greyhounds from this duty, which was high-speed haulage of passenger trains on the generally flat route between Adelaide and Port Pirie. The express train running between Nurram and Port Pirie at 70 miles per hour was a breathtaking experience. There were 3 passenger services a day to Port Pirie with connections to Perth and Alice Springs. The diesel 900 class and later 930s ran to the same timetable. In later years, Bluebird railcars provided the service. The connections along the way were quite remarkable. A connection was made at Bowmans for Moonta goods trains and Snowtown with the railcar from Moonta to Brinkworth. The services that connected at Port Pirie with the Trans-Australia to Perth always had a cafeteria car, now at NRM. At times when the cafeteria car was out of service, the Adelaide dining car was substituted, also now at the National Railway Museum. Other services used the Bowmans refreshment room stop. Certain Port Pirie trains had a trailing van attached behind the brake van. These vans with high-speed bogies were stencilled Adelaide to Port Pirie passenger trains only. In 1982, the Adelaide to Port Pirie line was converted to standard gauge and diverted through to Crystal Brook, leaving the broad gauge Meriton to Port Pirie section isolated and finally closed and dismantled. Most trains now bypassed Port Pirie, and Mary Ely Street Station closed in 1989. The abandoned section of line included sidings or stations at Meriton, Warrilba/Wandera, Nurram and Port Pirie. It's time to dig a little deeper and fly a little higher as we hit the ground and go exploring on the section from Meriton to Port Pirie and put the drone up to see what the view looks like from above. Well, we're out here at Wandeera. They've done a pretty good job of removing any trace of the railway through here. But again, one of the telltale ways you can tell that a railway was once here is where they've used the old rails, cut them up and made them into fence posts. You know, I was trying to work out what the deal was with Warulba siding and Wandeera siding, but here's the story. It was renamed. And there we have it, the last remains of Wandeera siding. Well, here we are somewhere between Meriton and Crystal Brook and Port Pirie. We're at New Rom, and we've found probably one of the most exciting things you'll find remaining on this stretch of old railway line. New Rom, as described here on the plaque, is actually the Aboriginal word for stopping place station. At one point in time, this had a bunch of cottages, mechanical loading cranes, sheep loading ramps, goods platform. It was all taken away when the line was closed in 1982. We're here at Mary Ely Street Station at Port Pirie. We're on the broad gauge side of the platform where the broad gauge line from Adelaide ended. The passage of time has erased most traces of the old broad gauge line between Red Hill and Port Pirie. Farmers' fields now cover the whole lot.
If you did enjoy the video, then give me a thumbs up and subscribe, and who knows where I'll pop up next. See you then.